It was a quiet, starless night, and the world outside the Petersons' cozy suburban home seemed to be in a deep slumber. Inside, the family of four had finally settled in after a long day. The warm glow of a single lamp lit the living room where Max, their curious black cat, lay curled up on the couch. To anyone looking in, it appeared to be just another ordinary night in the neighborhood. But appearances can be deceiving. The clock struck midnight, and Max's ears perked up. A faint sound, a barely audible creak, echoed from the back door. His emerald eyes snapped open, glinting with an intensity that could only mean one thing. Something was wrong. The Petersons had always joked about Max being overly protective, his antics sometimes bordering on obsessive. But tonight, there was no playfulness in his demeanor. His sleek body tensed as he leapt silently to the floor, moving with the precision of a shadow. He padded towards the source of the noise, his tail flicking like a metronome counting down the seconds to something ominous. Meanwhile, upstairs, Sarah Peterson stirred in her sleep. A strange unease crept into her dreams, pulling her awake. She sat up, her heart beating a little faster than usual, a sense of foreboding washing over her. Downstairs, Max was now at the back door, his low growl cutting through the silence of the night like a warning bell. What could it be? A stray animal? A forgotten window left ajar? Or something far more sinister? Unbeknownst to the family, danger was already inside their home. Tonight, Max wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian. And what he was about to do would not only save the family but reveal a truth so chilling it would haunt them forever. Stay with us as we unravel the events of that terrifying night and uncover the incredible story of how a cat became the unlikely hero in a battle between safety and peril. The Peterson home was nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by towering oaks that cast long, twisted shadows under the faint glow of the streetlights. At night, the neighborhood transformed. The laughter of children and the hum of lawnmowers gave way to an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant howl of a lone coyote. Inside the house, the atmosphere was deceptively calm. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen, where dishes from dinner still sat in the sink. The family's cozy living room, filled with familiar trinkets and the scent of lavender candles, offered a sense of security. Yet it felt fragile, as if the peace could shatter at any moment. Max moved through the shadows like a wraith, his every movement deliberate. His sleek black coat blended seamlessly with the dimly lit interior, his glowing green eyes the only giveaway of his presence. He approached the back door with calculated precision, his senses heightened. Something was out there, or perhaps in there. A cool draft slipped through the crack of the slightly ajar window in the hallway. It whispered through the curtains, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that Max's sharp nose picked up instantly. The smell was out of place, foreign, and it sent a shiver through his wiry frame. Upstairs, Sarah rubbed her eyes, her unease growing. She glanced at the clock, 12:15 a.m., and felt the weight of the silence pressing against her. "Why do I feel like something's watching me?" she murmured to herself. Her husband, Daniel, slept soundly beside her, oblivious to the quiet tension creeping through the house. Max let out a low growl that resonated through the darkness, startling Sarah out of her thoughts. "Max," she whispered, more to herself than to him, as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. She hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of unseen threats. Every creak, every flicker of shadow seemed alive with intent. Whatever was happening, the night wasn't going to let them rest. The Peterson family had always been a close-knit unit. Daniel, the father, was a reserved yet loving man who spent his weekdays managing a small hardware store in town. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind of person who could fix a leaky faucet or calm a crying child with the same steady hands. But Daniel had his struggles. Losing his younger brother in an accident years ago had left a shadow over his otherwise cheerful demeanor. He worked tirelessly to create a safe, stable environment for his family, often burying his anxieties beneath a layer of calm practicality. Sarah, his wife, was the heart of the household. A teacher by profession, She had an innate warmth that made people gravitate toward her. She loved books, especially mysteries, and would often lose herself in their twisting plots. It was ironic, she often thought, how she found comfort in fictional danger while doing everything to shield her family from real-world threats. But even Sarah wasn't immune to the quiet fears of parenthood. Worries about her kids' futures, about her marriage growing too routine, and about the strange, recurring dreams she'd been having lately, where she'd wander through their house in the dark, unable to find her way out. The children, Emma and Noah, brought life and chaos to the Peterson home. Emma, the eldest at 12, was whip-smart and fiercely independent. Her room a testament to her creativity, with its walls covered in sketches and posters of fantasy worlds. She often acted older than her age, a trait that endeared her to adults but sometimes frustrated her parents. Noah, on the other hand, was only 8 and still very much a child, full of boundless energy and endless questions. He adored Max, their black cat, and spent hours playing with him, convinced that Max was more than just a pet. Max, of course, wasn't an ordinary cat. He had been a stray when Sarah found him 2 years ago, skinny and covered in dirt, hiding beneath her car in a grocery store parking lot. Something about his piercing green eyes had compelled her to take him home, despite Daniel's mild protests. From the moment Max entered their lives, he seemed to take on the role of guardian. He'd always been unusually attentive, watching over the kids as they played, appearing beside Sarah when she stayed up late grading papers, and growling softly whenever he sensed something, or someone, out of place. That night, as Sarah descended the stairs, she found Max sitting rigidly in front of the locked basement door. His ears were pinned back, his tail swishing in sharp, deliberate movements. He let out a guttural hiss, his glowing eyes fixed on the door as though daring it to move. "What is it, Max?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She knelt beside him, her hand reaching out instinctively to comfort him. But Max didn't take his eyes off the door. His body was taut, every muscle coiled as if ready to pounce. Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his eyes. "Sarah, what's going on?" "Max," she began, hesitating. "He's acting strange. He won't leave this door." Daniel frowned, stepping closer. "The basement? Did one of the kids leave it open earlier?" Sarah shook her head. "No. I locked it after putting away the holiday decorations this afternoon. I'm sure of it." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft creak, the kind of sound wood makes when weight shifts on it. Came from the basement. Sarah and Daniel froze, their eyes darting to the door. "Emma? Noah?" Daniel called, his voice firm, but a quick check revealed the children were still upstairs, sound asleep. Daniel returned, his face pale but resolute. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising even herself. "If something or someone is down there, we need to handle this together." Max let out a sharp yowl, his body pressing against the door as if trying to keep whatever was on the other side at bay. For the first time, Sarah felt a deep sense of unease. Max wasn't just reacting to a sound. He was protecting them from something he understood far better than they did. As Daniel hesitated, Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on? Why is Max so loud?" Sarah motioned for her to stay back. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just go back to bed. We'll take care of it." But Emma didn't move. Instead, her gaze shifted to Max, her brow furrowing. "He only does that when there's danger," she said softly, her voice tinged with worry. Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah, his grip tightening on the flashlight. The Petersons had always thought of themselves as an ordinary family, dealing with ordinary problems. Tonight, however, something extraordinary and terrifying was waiting for them behind that locked door. The air in the Peterson house had grown thick with tension. Max's low growl reverberated throughout the living room as Sarah and Daniel exchanged uncertain glances. Despite their best efforts to brush it off as an overreaction to some trivial thing, the sense of dread only deepened as the silence stretched between them. Daniel, with his flashlight in hand, took a step toward the basement door. "I'll check it out," he said, though his voice betrayed more apprehension than he cared to admit. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find. Maybe a pipe had burst, or one of the kids had accidentally left something on the basement stairs. But deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be something as simple as that. "Wait," Sarah whispered, catching his arm before he could reach the door. "What if it's something worse?" Her voice trembled, despite her best attempt to remain calm. Max hissed louder, backing away from the door in rapid, jerky movements. His body was taut, ears flattened against his head, tail flicking erratically behind him. There was something primal in the way he was acting, something that warned them this wasn't just a minor issue. They were dealing with something far more dangerous. Daniel felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. He wanted to laugh off Sarah's fear, but he couldn't shake the unease in his chest. Max, for all his oddities, was never this agitated. The cat was acting like he knew something they didn't, and it terrified Daniel. "Maybe we should call someone," Sarah said, her voice trembling more than before. "Maybe this isn't something we can handle ourselves." Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to steady his breath, but the uneasiness in his gut gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on being the one people turned to for solutions, for reassurance in times of trouble. But tonight, he didn't feel like the protector he imagined himself to be. The sense of dread from the basement seemed to creep up his spine, making him second-guess everything. "I'll just take a quick look," he said, determination creeping back into his voice, though it was laced with uncertainty. "Stay here with the kids. Keep Max close. If anything happens, call for help." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Daniel and the basement door. She opened her mouth to protest but was stopped by a sharp, panicked yowl from Max. It was so loud and fierce that it made Sarah's heart race. Max's eyes were wide with terror, staring at the basement as if he could sense something more sinister just beyond the door. Max's reaction stirred something in Sarah. Instinctively, she knew that this was more than a simple pet scare. This was an urgent warning. She grabbed Daniel's arm again. "I don't think we should be alone in there. It's not just the basement. It's whatever is behind that door." Daniel finally nodded. "All right," he said, his voice low, his gaze shifting from Max to Sarah. "We'll both go down. If we don't feel safe, we'll get out of there." Max yowled again, his claws scratching the wooden floor in his distress. With a final glance at their children, Emma standing at the top of the stairs, Noah holding his blanket tightly as he watched from his bedroom doorway, Daniel pushed the basement door open. The darkness beyond was overwhelming, a yawning void that seemed to swallow up the small light from his flashlight. The air was cooler down here, the smell of earth and dust more pronounced, as though it had been untouched for a long time. As he stepped into the darkness, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Every sound felt amplified in the silence. His footsteps on the cold concrete, the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distant corners, the ever-present hum of the house's old plumbing. Max was at the top of the stairs now, his eyes glowing eerily in the dim light, watching the couple as they descended. His fur was bristled, and his tail was twitching. Sarah could feel her heart racing as she followed Daniel down the stairs. The basement seemed to stretch endlessly. Shelves of old tools and boxes stacked high lined the walls. There was a workbench in the far corner, covered in dusty old appliances. But something felt wrong about this room. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like they were intruding on something ancient. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel's flashlight beam darted across the room, revealing shadows that seemed to move at the edge of his vision. The basement was small but packed with clutter, each corner more unnerving than the last. As he approached the far end of the room, where the door had always stood locked, a sudden chill ran up his spine. It was as though the door were watching him, waiting. "We're almost there," Sarah whispered, voice barely audible. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch Daniel's sleeve. Max's growls grew louder, more intense, as though he were warning them to turn back. At last they reached the door. The wooden frame looked old, distressed, but it had always been sturdy. There were no signs of tampering, no obvious reason why Max would be acting this way. But something was undeniably wrong. The lock was still intact, just as Sarah had left it. Daniel looked at Sarah, then at the door, and something within him shifted. He knew they had to open it. Whatever was beyond it had already made its presence known. Their lives would never be the same unless they confronted it. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. She couldn't deny the fear in her chest, but the need for answers overpowered it. The lock creaked as Daniel turned it. As he slowly pushed the door open, the tension in the air grew unbearable. For a moment, nothing happened. There was just the sound of their breath, quick, shallow, and the ever-ominous hum of the old house. Then, a gust of cold air rushed from the darkness, slamming the door open completely. Behind the door, in the farthest corner of the room, a shadow loomed. It was a figure tall and thin, barely visible in the dim light. At first, Daniel thought it was a trick of the light, some illusion his brain was conjuring to explain the fear that was now crawling under his skin. But then the figure moved. It stepped forward, its long, gangly limbs emerging from the shadows. As it came into the light, it revealed a pale, ashen face. A face that looked familiar, but one that shouldn't be here. Sarah gasped. The figure's hollow eyes locked with hers, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. "What the hell is that?" Daniel's voice trembled as he pulled Sarah behind him, instinctively reaching for the flashlight. He shone it directly at the figure, but it didn't flinch. It simply stood there, unmoving, its presence oppressive. The figure smiled, a slow, menacing grin. The basement door slammed shut behind them. The basement door banged shut with a violent force, sending a shockwave of panic through both Sarah and Daniel. The sudden sound of the door locking itself, without them touching it, made their hearts race even faster. Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room as he tried to keep it steady, but his hands were trembling. Sarah gripped his arm, her body cold with fear, as they both stared at the figure in front of them. It didn't move, but its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, never left them. The room felt suffocating now, the air heavy, as though the walls were closing in. The temperature had dropped drastically, and Sarah could see her breath puffing out in front of her in tiny, trembling clouds. "What do you want?" Daniel's voice cracked. He could barely keep it steady, and even in the quiet of the basement, it felt like his voice was being swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figure didn't respond, but the smile on its face twisted, becoming wider and more disturbing. Every muscle in Daniel's body screamed to run, but his legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. The figure was somehow familiar, though he couldn't place it. There was something about its presence that felt both ancient and unnatural, as if it had been lurking here, waiting for them to open the door. Max, still at the top of the stairs, yowled again, a sharp, frantic cry that echoed through the basement. His cries were filled with warning, his body twitching in agitation. He clawed at the steps as if trying to break free from some invisible barrier, his cries becoming more desperate. The figure's eyes shifted, slowly, from Daniel to Sarah, and then back again. In that moment, Sarah realized something. They weren't alone. The figure wasn't the only presence in the room. She felt something brushing against her skin, as if something unseen was moving just behind her, close enough for her to feel its icy breath on her neck. I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is this?" As if on cue, the lights in the basement flickered and then went out completely. The flashlight in Daniel's hand was their only source of illumination now, and it too seemed to lose power, the beam dimming with every passing second. The air grew colder still, and the once stale air of the basement became sharp and biting. It wasn't just the temperature that had changed. It felt as though the very energy in the room had shifted, like something was drawing from them, draining them. Max's cries grew louder, more frantic. Sarah could feel her pulse racing in her ears. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She could only stare, horrified, at the figure that now began to move toward them. The floorboards creaked under its weight as it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its long, bony fingers extending as if to reach out and touch them. The figure's movements were unnatural, stiff, almost like it was dragging itself through the air rather than walking. Its skin, pale and stretched thin, seemed to shimmer in the dim light, the shadows of its body seeming to stretch and elongate in impossible ways. Suddenly, it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once, vibrating in their skulls. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The words hung in the air like an omen. Sarah froze, the blood draining from her face. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Daniel's hand clenched around the flashlight, but even the strength in his grip couldn't control the fear that was spreading like wildfire through his body. The figure took another step forward, its eyes glinting in the darkness. "The door was never meant to be opened," it rasped. "You've disturbed something ancient. You've let it in." A strange sound filled the basement, like a whispering wind, but there was no breeze. It carried words in an unintelligible language, words that felt like they were digging into their minds, leaving marks of confusion and dread. The air thickened with the presence of something malevolent, something that wasn't human. Sarah's heart raced, her chest tightening with each passing second. She had to fight the urge to scream, to run, because she knew there was nowhere to go. In the corner of the room, something else shifted, and Sarah turned quickly. The pile of old boxes stacked against the wall had moved. One of the boxes had tipped over, revealing a crack in the wall, a dark, jagged line that hadn't been there before. As if to punctuate the horror, the figure smiled wider, its teeth elongated and sharp, glinting in the dim light. "I didn't want it to be like this," the figure said, "but you've opened the door. Now you must pay the price." A deep, resonating sound echoed from within the walls of the basement, like a low rumble, as if the earth itself was beginning to tremble. The very foundation of the house seemed to be shaking in time with the noise. Max's growls intensified, a warning sound that seemed to rattle the very air around them. His claws scraped against the floorboards, as if he was trying to claw his way through the walls to reach them. And then, without warning, the figure lunged. Its movements were a blur of unnatural speed. Sarah gasped, stepping back, but she was too slow. The figure's hand, its long, skeletal fingers, shot out toward her, grasping for her throat. But just as its fingers made contact, a shrill, sharp yowl pierced the air. "Max, the cat." In one swift motion, Max launched himself from the top of the stairs, hurling himself at the figure with an intensity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. His claws dug into the figure's arm, and with a screech of fury, Max managed to tear the figure's hand away from Sarah's throat. For a split second, the creature faltered, recoiling in pain, as though it had been momentarily stunned. Sarah didn't know how to process what was happening, how a small cat could fight against such an ancient force. But in that moment, Max became their last line of defense. The creature hissed in rage, its once empty eyes now filled with an unholy fury. It swung wildly, trying to claw at Max, but the cat was quick, his movements like a blur of shadow and fur. With one final vicious swipe, Max managed to sink his claws deep into the creature's face. The figure screeched, a horrible, blood-curdling cry that echoed through the basement, reverberating in their skulls. The light flickered again, then suddenly went out completely. In the darkness, there was only the sound of the creature's angry growls and the frantic movements of Max, as if he was battling something far beyond their understanding. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the world around her spinning. Then, the rumbling sound from the walls grew louder, more intense. "Run!" Daniel shouted, his voice raw with terror. They didn't need any more prompting. With Max still fighting in the dark, Sarah and Daniel turned and ran toward the stairs, not daring to look back. The basement, once so familiar, had become a nightmare of shadows and whispers, a place where something ancient and terrifying lurked. And as they reached the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind them. The basement door slammed shut with a deafening crash, locking them inside. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, and the blood drained from her face as she turned to look at Daniel. The darkness around them was suffocating, The only sound in the air the frantic scratching of Max's claws against the wooden floor below. Sarah's hands shook uncontrollably as she gripped the banister, but her thoughts were racing. It was impossible. How could a cat be the one to save them? But right now, there was no time to question. The air was thick with tension as the creature's presence loomed over them. Sarah could feel it in every nerve of her body, a chilling, unshakable sensation that told her something was closing in on them. Something ancient, something far more dangerous than they could ever have anticipated. "Sarah, we need to go." Daniel's voice cracked with desperation. His hand was tight around her arm, urging her to move, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the locked door, the one that had sealed them in with this malevolent force. Then a flicker. The dim light from the flashlight illuminated the edges of the room. Max's low growl echoed through the basement, steady but filled with warning. He was standing at the foot of the stairs, poised like a soldier ready to protect them at all costs. "Max, come on," Sarah whispered hoarsely, her voice shaky but laced with urgency. The creature hadn't moved. Its eyes remained fixed on them, burning with a terrifying intensity. Sarah could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the tension, the slow-building fear that gnawed at the edges of her mind. The creature was waiting. It was waiting for them to make the next move, and she wasn't sure what would happen if they did. Max yowled again, his body stiffening, fur bristling as his claws scraped against the wooden floor in anticipation. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, but before Sarah could answer, the answer came in the form of a shriek, a high-pitched, spine-chilling scream that echoed through the house, shaking the very walls. The door behind them began to rattle violently. The air grew thick and heavy, as though an invisible pressure was building up around them. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly in her ears, it was almost impossible to hear anything else. Then, just as quickly as the scream had started, it stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the house. It was so thick, so complete, that Sarah could feel it pressing against her. Time seemed to stretch, then snap back, and that was when she heard it. A low, sinister whisper, like the hiss of wind through a cracked window, but it was coming from behind the door. "You've made a terrible mistake." The words didn't just float through the air. They seemed to invade her mind. The voice was cold, and Sarah felt an icy chill crawl down her spine, freezing her from the inside out. The world around her blurred, and in that moment, she felt the overwhelming weight of the decision they had made. She had opened the door. Max's growls intensified, each one growing louder, more insistent. The cat's body quivered, his claws gripping the wood beneath him, and then, without warning, he leaped. Max's movements were too fast for Sarah to follow, but she didn't need to see everything to know what was happening. The creature hissed in fury as the cat slashed through the air with vicious precision, his claws digging deep into the figure's arm. The figure recoiled, its hollow eyes flashing with surprise and anger, but Max didn't stop. He was relentless, a blur of fur and claws as he attacked again and again, tearing at the figure with terrifying ferocity. The figure shrieked again, its body writhing and twisting as if the very touch of Max's claws was burning it. The force behind Max's attack was enough to make the walls tremble, the air crackling with tension. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah and Daniel stood frozen, watching as Max fought with all the strength and fury of a warrior. But just as quickly as the creature had been stunned, it lashed out, its long, bony fingers reaching for Max with deadly speed. "No!" Sarah screamed, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. But before the figure could grasp Max, the cat managed one final, brutal strike, sinking his claws deep into the creature's chest. The figure let out a horrific screech, a sound so loud and gut-wrenching that it reverberated through the walls, and the air seemed to warp around them. With a sudden jolt, the creature's body jerked violently, its eyes flashing once before going completely still. For a moment, there was no sound. The room fell into a deafening silence, as if the entire house had taken a breath and held it. Max, his fur ruffled and his body trembling with the effort, stepped back, his glowing eyes fixed on the figure. The creature's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Its presence seemed to dissipate into the air, as if it had never existed in the first place. The pressure, the heavy, suffocating feeling, was gone. Sarah and Daniel stood still, hardly daring to breathe, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Max's growls softened into low purrs, his body finally relaxing as he padded back toward them. Sarah dropped to her knees in relief, her hands trembling as she reached out to scoop him up. She couldn't speak, couldn't form the words to express what she felt. She could only hold him close, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. Daniel, too, collapsed beside her, his head in his hands, his body trembling from the shock of it all. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and with it, the exhaustion. They had survived against all odds. But even as Sarah sat there, holding Max in her arms, there was a lingering question. What had they truly unleashed? For the first time since they had opened the door, the house was silent. But the silence was too deep, too still. It didn't feel like a peaceful resolution. It felt like something had been left undone. Max's ears twitched, his eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that told Sarah that the danger wasn't truly over. But for now, they had survived. The door to the basement, the one they had opened so recklessly, was now locked. But Sarah knew that it wasn't just a door. It was a portal, one that had led them into a world far darker and more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. And whatever had been lurking behind it wasn't gone. It was waiting, but for now they were safe. They had Max, their unlikely hero, to thank for that. As Sarah held Max tightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As Sarah sat there, Max nestled securely in her arms. Her thoughts swirled in a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The nightmare that had haunted their family was over, at least for now, but she couldn't shake the weight of what they had experienced. The house, once a comforting place to call home, now felt different. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the terror they had endured. Max, the cat they had always taken for granted, had proven to be their savior. It was almost impossible to believe that the small creature, so often overlooked, had been the one to lead them through the darkest hour of their lives. Sarah's heart swelled with emotion as she gently stroked his fur. The courage that had manifested in such an unexpected form left her in awe. In the midst of chaos, they had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the smallest, most unassuming things carry the greatest power. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a protector, a guardian sent to stand watch when no one else could. And though Sarah had initially dismissed his strange behavior, the warnings, the growls, she now saw them in a completely new light. They were signs, clues she had failed to understand until it was almost too late. As she looked over at Daniel, she saw the same realization reflected in his eyes. They had both been changed. The experience had stripped them of their assumptions and fears, revealing a deeper bond between them, one forged in the fires of terror. They had faced something that no one could prepare for, something that tested their courage, their sanity, and their resolve. And they had survived. But even in the midst of relief, Sarah knew that the story wasn't over. There was still a lingering sense of unease, a silent whisper in the back of her mind. The house might be quiet now, but she knew that the darkness they had uncovered was far from gone. The door had only been sealed temporarily. What lay beyond it, the creature they had confronted, would always be a part of them. Max's purring was the only sound in the room, steady and reassuring. But Sarah knew that they could never forget what they had learned. The world was full of mysteries, of dangers that lurked just out of sight. And though they had triumphed over one, she couldn't shake the thought that there were many more yet to come. As they sat there in the eerie quiet of the house, Sarah's heart swelled with love for her family and their unexpected protector. But she also felt a deep sense of wonder. What else was out there, waiting to be discovered? And what other lessons would life teach them, in ways they could never imagine? For now, Sarah knew one thing for certain. They were safe, but the world was bigger, darker, and far more mysterious than they could ever have realized. If you were as captivated by Max's bravery and the terrifying events that unfolded as we were, Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was lurking behind that door? And how do you think it all ties together? Drop your predictions or theories in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Don't miss out on future videos that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community of mystery lovers, and stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the answers we seek are right under our noses, if we just dare to look.